I'm Wendy Cutler. I'm the Vice President of the Asia Society Policy Institute. And we at the Asia Society are so proud of our strong partnership with the Embassy of Australia and Australia more generally, particularly given that the president of the Asia Society Policy Institute is a former Prime Minister of Australia, Kevin Rudd. We have a great program organized today, and to kick things off, it's really my pleasure to introduce our first speaker, the Honorable Joe Hockey. Ambassador Hockey has been serving as the Ambassador of Australia to the United States since January 2016, and over the past 3.5 years, he has established himself as really a leading figure in Washington's diplomatic community. Before that, he led a long and distinguished career of public service back in Australia, and I think he first joined as Member of Parliament in 1996, and since then has held a number of positions as minister, ranging from financial services to small business and tourism and human services, among others. And in 2013, Ambassador Hockey was appointed Treasurer of the Commonwealth, overseeing economic and fiscal policy. Given his wealth of experience in trade and international economic policy, we are really lucky to have him help us frame our discussion today. So please join me in welcoming to the podium Ambassador Hockey.
Well, thanks very much, Wendy, and can I thank everyone so much for coming here to the Australian Embassy. The good news is that the rain has stopped. Perhaps even the better news is this is the last time we'll be meeting in this room because we're demolishing the building. So savour everything and feel free to graffiti the walls or whatever takes your fancy over the next couple of hours. And we'll be moving across the road to the National Geographic building for a short period of time, hopefully, depending on the speed of builders in Washington, D.C., and then be returning here to a brand new building. So it is I'm particularly pleased to be here welcoming the Asia Society Policy Institute, and as Wendy said, former Prime Minister Kevin Rudd is the chair of the Policy Institute, and so we have a particular interest in today's events. Of course, we have a very deep interest in the Asia-Pacific, Indo-Pacific region. We're there, but also it is the not only fastest growing region in the world, but it's the fastest growing region in the history of humanity. And over the period to 2030, which in fact isn't that far away, we expect it'll become the home to 3.2 billion people in the middle class. And in every developed economy, the consumer demand of the middle class is the heartbeat of growth in the economy. So the fact is that not only can the Indo-Pacific region not be ignored, it is going to be the dominant economic force in the world in the second half of this century. And the best way to promote that is through free and fair trade. The fact is that we are particularly happy that we've had a number of high-quality free trade agreements in the region. When I was Treasurer, our government signed free trade agreements with China, with Korea and with Japan. And of course, Australia had a role to play with our friends in New Zealand and a number of other countries in making sure that the Trans-Pacific Partnership proceeded, despite the United States deciding not to be a part of it. But that covers a zone of with trade of over $10 trillion in GDP. We also want to see a modern, high-quality, regional, comprehensive economic partnership. And we expect negotiations to conclude this year. But as I said, you need to have a rich mix of different agreements, be they bilateral or multilateral agreements. And at the end of the day, that helps to lift the quality of life of the billions of people in the middle class, and importantly, helps to provide opportunities for people in the aspirational classes to be able to get ahead. We want to see more and more people get out of poverty as fast as possible. And that's going to take a combination of economic levers. Of course, there's the trade agreements, which are really important, but also infrastructure is hugely important, particularly in the Indo-Pacific region, where there is latent demand for $26 trillion of new infrastructure that has to be built over the next 10 to 15 years just to meet the economic growth requirements of the region. So that's hugely important as well. It's important to have frameworks for this in terms of infrastructure. For example, Vice President Pence and Prime Minister Abe and Prime Minister Morrison announced a commitment to the provision of electricity throughout Papua New Guinea during the recent APEC meeting in November. But also the infrastructure extends to organisational infrastructure. And Australia, together with our friends, are very committed to modernising the World Trade Organisation. And if we are going to rebuild faith in organisations, we need to make sure that the infrastructure associated with those organisations is robust and wins widespread support. Today we are quite blessed to have a number of very special guests. Ambassador Ashok Mirpuri from Singapore. He's almost the Dean of the Diplomatic Corps, having been here for 35 years in Washington. Nearly. It's fantastic. And I'm sure he feels every one of them at the moment. 7 years, but he is widely respected throughout the Diplomatic Corps, and to welcome him and also Ambassador Rosemary Banks from New Zealand, who is perhaps one of the newest ambassadors to join the Diplomatic Corps and has had an extraordinarily distinguished career on behalf of New Zealand over a lengthy period of time. We are here to frame the discussion with a new independent paper issued by the Asia Society Policy Institute titled Trade in Trouble, How the Asia Pacific Can Step Up and Lead Reforms. Let me say we don't have a choice about leadership, because we are the fastest, most dynamic economic region in the world over the next at least 70 years. So there is a massive leadership role to play for everyone in our region, and that includes the United States. The paper is authored by 6 well-known trade experts, including, of course, Wendy Cutler, who has had a very distinguished career at USTR, and now Asia Society Policy Institute, and Peter Gray, who's one of our distinguished former ambassadors to the WTO and Japan, and several other ambassadors, trade ministers and experts from across Asia have contributed to this. To discuss the paper, we have the outstanding panel, including, of course, Jenny Leonard, our moderator from Bloomberg, and our two visiting ambassadors. So I really appreciate all of you being here. I hope it is an open, forthright and robust discussion. You're absolutely right, Wendy. We'll have some Australian wine after this. I just note that we were able to negotiate zero tariffs on Australian wines with China. So there is it's a very fast-growing market for us, which is interesting given that an Australian wine company is in fact the biggest producer of wine in the Napa Valley in California. So Penfolds, they own Beringer, and they also have a massive presence in Australia. So that makes for very interesting conversations about trade policy involving Australian wine. But I won't digress. Thank you everyone for coming, and please welcome back Wendy. Thank you.
Well, thanks again for those great remarks, and you've certainly set the stage for a really lively event. And my greatest thanks not only to Ambassador Hockey, but to really his entire staff, led by Elizabeth, for picking up the phone when I called about hosting the event here, and without a beat saying yes, even though they were moving shortly. I didn't realize it was so soon. I hear we're not the last event, so on that graffiti, you might want to be a little restrained. And I'm thrilled to see so many of my former colleagues and current friends in the audience, so I'm hoping we can have a really lively discussion. Before we start with the panel, I thought I would just make a few remarks about the paper that we are issuing today. It's called Trade in Trouble and How the Asia Pacific Can Step Up and Lead Reforms. This is really the third in a series of annual reports that we have issued since I've joined the Asia Society, where we convene a group of senior trade experts, truth be told, a lot of my former colleagues, who still really care about these issues and now have the time to really think them through. And together, we put together a paper heavy on recommendations for policymakers, not only in the United States, but also in Asia. So a few comments on the paper. First, we've tried to keep it short. As a former government worker, when I used to get these papers and they were really long, I would kind of read the executive summary, maybe read the conclusion, and then put the paper down. And so we have tried to keep the paper, once again, heavy on recommendations. There is an executive summary, and heavy on conclusions. I also just mentioned that what makes this paper unique is that it's not just a U.S. think tank paper. It really reflects the contribution based on 2 days of intensive discussion in Australia in February among the following folks from around the trade world, and many of you probably know of these people. Ambassador Hockey just mentioned Peter Gray. Elizabeth, I don't know where you're sitting, but she mentioned that Peter Gray was her first boss in Geneva. I'm sure he was really nice. Jay Kim, who I negotiated against and with during the chorus negotiations in 2007, who then became Minister of Trade for Korea and went on to become a member of the National Assembly. Mari Pangestu from Indonesia, former trade minister and just a leading, really thought leader on trade from Indonesia. Yoichi Suzuki, who just recently left the Ministry of Foreign Affairs from Japan, and he was the negotiator they brought in at the end to close the EU-Japan deal. Now, I'm over it that they agreed to zero wine tariffs on entry into force. But that's what they did, and I think under the current negotiations with Japan, the U.S. is aiming to get that same status. And then finally, from China, we were so lucky to have Tu Xinchuan, who is professor and dean at China's Institute for WTO Studies at the International Business and Economics in Beijing. And he's quoted widely in the Chinese press now about the current U.S.-China talks. Now, if you add up all the years that all these people have been working on trade, you get to a number of over 200 years. That doesn't mean we're really smart, and those were years that were well spent. But I think it shows the commitment of these people to the trade area. And finally, I would say the paper is just then drafted from the perspective of practitioners and not really of academics, which should make it more readable. Now, in terms of some substantive takeaways from the paper, I would just underscore a few. Number one, and anyone could conclude this, trade is under serious strain. The U.S. is retreating from leadership. The two largest economies in the world are in a trade dispute, and the WTO has really not been able to step up to the plate to kind of help smooth things out. The Asia-Pacific countries are in a unique position to really lead the region and lead the world to trying finding solutions to these issues. With respect to some specific recommendations, I'll just throw some out, and they're not in any real order. With respect to the CPTPP, we talk a bit about accession to this agreement. It seems that based on our discussions, that Thailand seems to be the most ready to express formal interest. And our report also raises the prospects not only of the U.S. rejoining TPP at some point, but also perhaps China will be interested in joining, and maybe even the European Union. And I found this really interesting for trade wonks, that the European Union is either concluded or is in the process of ratifying or negotiating with 10 of the CPTPP countries, with the exception of one. I'm not going to tell you which one. You can all think about that, and we're going to have a little prize at the end of the person who can come up with that country. With respect to RCEP, and here is a fascinating discussion for me because the United States isn't part of these negotiations. There seems to be a real momentum to try and get these talks concluded this year. As I always say, if a negotiation, once it goes beyond 25 rounds, it's time to conclude those talks. I can only imagine when those negotiators get on the plane and have to see each other. It's probably a real incentive for them to do what they need to do to conclude the talks. We put forward some pragmatic suggestions about how they can conclude the talks, and maybe we can discuss these during the panel. With respect to the U.S.-China trade dispute, we spent a lot of time discussing the talks and the impact on the region and on the world. My partners really were urging a conclusion to the deal and lifting of tariffs and really providing certainty as soon as possible. With respect to the WTO, we recommend that for future negotiations, ongoing and future negotiations in the WTO, that the distinction between developing and developed countries be put aside and countries just negotiate based on what they really need from the talks on a case-by-case basis. We recommend that if the appellate body the appellate body discussion cannot be resolved, that folks think about extending the terms of the two appellate body members whose terms will expire at the end of the year. And we put forward the need for really pursuing plurilaterals, whether dealing with some of the practices presented by state-led economies or some of the new challenges presented by advanced technologies. And in this regard, we really question whether the MFN principle has outlived its usefulness. So I'm going to stop there. I'm going to invite the rest of the panel to the stage. We're thrilled that Jenny Leonard from Bloomberg is going to moderate the panel, and I am just honored to be joined by two ambassadors, Ambassador Mirpuri and Ambassador Banks. Please give them a hand, and guys, please come up to the podium.
Thanks for showing up, and thank you, Wendy, for inviting us. I think this is very timely. Obviously, I'm very looking forward to a lively discussion here, and I'm going to exclude Wendy for the first question because I want to hear from you, two ambassadors. How are Asian countries coping with the U.S.-China trade dispute, given that the U.S. and China are the top two trading partners for most countries in the region?
You're the Asian countries.
we treat New Zealand and Australia part of the same geography. But
really Asian.
Yes. Well, first, congratulations on putting the paper together, Wendy, you and your team. And it's always good to have people forcing some thinking of where we are on this. Now, to the question, Jenny, about how Asian countries are feeling, I think there's only one word for it: anxious. It is really a sense of anxiety when your two biggest trading partners, investment partners, the two most powerful countries in the region, the two countries, and in many ways, particularly the U.S. that has really led the region coming together, framed a broader architecture for the region on both economic and strategic issues, are in a dispute that doesn't seem to have a good prospect of resolution. Wendy said earlier that when you reach 25 rounds, it's time to conclude. The U.S.-China thing is at round 11, so we still have 14 more rounds to go. And that is not cause for great optimism, because so much of the trading patterns, supply chains in the region really factor both the U.S. and China. And when the two of them are putting tariffs in place when there are just a sense of both negotiating almost in the media, since they're no longer a set of talks going on, that causes great anxiety within the region. I think it's reflected also in the way stock markets are reacting as well to many of these conditions, particularly in the Asia Pacific. We want both of them to frame something out.
How soon? Soon? As soon as possible.
14 more rounds to go. We'll wait for that. Yes. Well, you know, you've got this G20 meeting between the two presidents, hopefully.
Yep.
The last time they met at the G20 in Argentina, they froze the tariffs. And whether at this meeting they can come out to some agreement or not, I am not quite sure. You know, what's happened in the past 5-6 months is that positions seemed to have been hardened. Both sides, as I mentioned, are really negotiating in the media. We're getting information, and partly reported by you as well, Jenny, about, you know, agreements being redacted, last-minute changes. That does not bode well. And the way that these things should work, and most people here have done these negotiations, you want to have almost 90 or 95% of the agreement put together by the time the leaders meet. If we have to rely on the leaders to kickstart the process again, I think you're going to have another long delay, and that will continue the anxiety the region feels when the two key players are not really partnering in something to frame that big architecture.
Professor Banks?
Well, speaking as the Pacific part of the Asia Pacific, I can only echo the anxiety. For New Zealand, China is our most important trading partner, and the US is our third. So it's obviously of considerable concern to us when the two have not been able to reach an agreement. And apart from the trade and economic impacts and flow-on effects, there's also the fact that we look to both of those partners for security involvement in our region as well. So we want to see those differences on the trade front sorted out. And I think, as Ambassador Mirpuri said, the longer it goes, the more difficult it is. It's not an original observation, but we all know that from our own negotiating experience. It becomes harder to retreat from positions. So fingers crossed, but in the meantime, I think one of the other questions is, how do we respond to this, especially if it's going to be a rather extended impasse? Well, for New Zealand, we are doing all we can to become more deeply involved in the regional economic architecture, and for that reason the CPTPP and RCEP are really, really important for us. We've in the past learned the lessons of being too dependent on one market in that part of our history on the United Kingdom, and we are very conscious of the need to have as many different trading partners as we can. On US-China, and if they are to reach a deal, what would you like to see in it, and what are your biggest concerns with a no-deal scenario? Maybe even Wendy can start if she wants.
What I like to see in it? Quick access for U.S. wine to China. No, I'm kidding. You know, it's interesting. In my view, a lot of progress had been made in the negotiations, and progress had been made not only on purchasing commitments, but on structural reform issues, particular IPR and forced technology transfer, on market access items, including lifting of investment restrictions and getting rid of some other important barriers. And good work was being done, and progress had been made on establishing an enforcement mechanism. And in my view, it seems like the negotiators got pretty far along, and then they kind of had that moment where any trade negotiator, I think, will tell you they've gone through that moment where you have to look at that deal, it's almost done, and you have that moment where you're like, is this really, if I conclude this deal and I bring it home, am I going to be able to get the support that I need? And I think both sides really had second thoughts when they looked at how close they were getting, and they were hearing criticism in China, hearing it more, internally from other party members. In the U.S., from the public, And I think both sides, because of those second thoughts, they number one, China came back and took things off the table. And at least what I've heard maybe is that the U.S. came forward and asked for more things. And that's not a great dynamic when you're trying to close a negotiation. Mm-hmm. So I would really hope that the two sides would find a way back to the table, try and pick it up from where they left, although I think that could be very difficult, particularly given this volley of words that we're hearing between the two countries. But I do think that hopefully the G20 will be a real, there'll be a good discussion and at a minimum an agreement to resume the talks with some sort of guidance to the negotiators.
Mm-hmm. What about content of a deal or maybe fears of a no-deal scenario?
I think what seems to have happened is that both sides have lost trust in each other. Both sides, aside from the contents of the deal, both sides feel that the other side is not negotiating in good faith. The Americans feel that the Chinese may be slow-walking this until the election, and maybe there'll be a different election outcome, and then they can start this again. And so, and on the other side, there is this sense that the U.S. approach is one of really forcing fundamental changes in the Chinese system. And the Chinese are not prepared to accept that. So when you have lost this trust on both sides, each one either playing the slow game and each one recognizing that there are politics that come into play in this. The U.S. political calendar is very quickly catching up into the 2020 elections. You've got 18 months to go. And the president and his base really focus on trade as a key issue. China has politics as well. It may be a smaller internal political conversation. And I think that in that framework, until you can rebuild some sort of trust between the two sides, I think that's where the G20 meeting between President Xi and President Trump becomes quite important. Can they rebuild the trust? The kind of trust that they had, and they've had fairly regular meetings since April 2017 when President Xi met President Trump at Mar-a-Lago in Argentina. Like, can they rebuild the trust that gives the negotiators the sense that when you come back to the agreement, you're not going to be second-guessed by either side? The advisors on either side would then say, this is not a good enough deal. I think that's where the challenge is. The scenario of a no deal is, I think, something most of us hope not to have to contemplate. Because it's not just a trade agreement. There are layers of other issues that have to be dealt with. There is military competition, there is technology competition. What this agreement is doing is just a trade part. If you cannot even get that sorted out, imagine the other areas of competition and challenge between the two sides. Each one of this could just spiral out of control. And that's, I think, the big concern in the region.
Yes, I'd certainly agree with that last one. You can't distinguish out the trade and economic dislocation of the relationship from all the other aspects that will need to be carefully managed in the coming period. So I think it's just, fingers crossed all round.
If I can just add on that point too, when I reflect on some of the negotiations that I've been engaged in and colleagues have been, like a free trade negotiation, many times you try with a country, you go forward with an FTA negotiation, and if they fail, you can kind of get back to where you were. You can figure out, maybe for the U.S. you want to have a TIFA type of relationship, or you find out a way to work together to resolve bilateral irritants. But in this case, I think what's so threatening is the fact that if these negotiations, if there's a no-deal scenario, we're not going back to the status quo. I mean, it's gonna be another world on the trade front, and I think a lot of the actions and the counteractions we're seeing are going to be accelerated and deepened to serious levels.
Sounds like everyone's cautiously optimistic.
No. I hope I didn't give that impression. No, I'm.
Isn't that a trade negotiator's favorite word?
Yes,
cautiously optimistic.
I stick with my anxious rather than cautiously optimistic. Yeah.
Well, we have seen Trump and Xi get in a room or on the phone, and things, going back to smooth sailing. So maybe, I don't know, we'll see. Okay, let's move away from the anxious issue back to CPTPP. Wendy's report singled out Thailand as the most likely to formally express interest in joining it. Do you agree with that? And what do you make of the report's suggestion that maybe the EU could join? Or is China a realistic prospect for the future to joining this?
You're a depository?
Well, we do think Thailand is a likely joiner, and we certainly see the CPTPP as a living agreement. We welcome countries who are prepared to meet the high standards to come on board. So we know that there's also been interest expressed not only by Thailand but Colombia, the UK. So yeah, the door's open if people can meet the conditions to come in.
I think that's the key point, Ambassador Banks, is we built a TPP. The US stepped away. We went down a couple of notches for the CPTPP. But the high standards are that important part. Whoever wants to come in, we need to bring them up to the high standards. And because this is a self-selected group of countries that wanted to have a closer economic relationship among themselves. Led by the US. I mean, I still give the US credit for bringing the TPP all the way where it was, and then the Japanese for sort of tweaking it to get us to CPTPP. So both, it's a high standard agreement. People can put up their hands to join. We need to make sure that when they do that, they're not pulling the standards down.
So is China a realistic prospect?
When China is ready to join, we'll be happy to. I mean, it was always the case with the TPP and RCEP that we create this free trade area with the Asia Pacific. If the Chinese are ready to join and meet those high standards, I think that would be ideal for us. And if the US decides to come back, that will be ideal. In the meantime, if you keep that momentum of that living agreement, first the four countries that haven't quite ratified, to get through their internal processes to get it through. And then partners like the Thais, whoever else wants to come, the British. In fact, probably the least likely, I think, is the EU. So I'm a little bit surprised that you mentioned the EU, because I find them the least likely ready to come into this, or the CPTPP ready to negotiate with the EU. That
well,
one
it's interesting because we did discuss this notion, like, would the EU ever exceed? We used the word in our report, join forces. Mm-hmm. But the reason, why we raised it was for just something to think about. Because if the EU really has agreements with 10 of the 11 CPTP countries, and for those of you who are thinking Brunei, you were right. That's the one country that they have, they're not negotiating with or have an agreement with. We just thought we'd put that on the, on the radar screen. It's something to think about. And if you can imagine if the EU could join forces with the CPTPP, and I don't know legally how that would be done through between a customs union and a free trade arrangement, then maybe the US would rejoin, because it'd kind of be the rest of the world.
I think it needs US leadership. If you remember when we had TPP and TTIP, the US was the common partner in both of this. Then you could have had maybe a coming together in some sort of arrangement or association between the two. Without that US role, I just find it difficult to see that quite happening. But, it's always nice to sort of look at big frameworks.
Yeah.
Wendy, I'm glad you said that you put it there just for an idea. We were kind of worried that we'd missed something important.
But you want to make sure that the CPTPP works.
Yeah.
So the 7 who've already in it, we were already starting to make sure that you're starting to get the trade moving through. And I think that's quite important, because if that works, then you have an attractive agreement that can potentially attract your Thailand and others to come in. If they find that the CPTPP is just an agreement signed and doesn't really have impact in terms of trade and services movement, then I think people will just lose interest in it.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. I don't know if the U.S. leadership right now would bring the EU along, but interesting thought. On RCEP, Ambassador Hockey, you stressed that the plan is to conclude it this year. do you agree? What are the prospects, and what would need to happen to make RCEP a reality?
Well, Singapore was in the chair of ASEAN last year, so we were leading the RCEP negotiations. My trade negotiators tell me we were this close, but, there's still very, very wide gaps. Unfortunately, we got stalled this year partly because of elections in some of the key RCEP countries. India had an election, Indonesia had an election, Thailand had an election, Australia had an election as well. And Australia is a key RCEP partner because they've helped frame some of the forward-looking ideas around it. Now that all these elections are through, Thailand still hasn't got their government in place yet. Indonesia will take a while, but we have the outcome is there. Maybe you can get momentum back on RCEP. Again, it's important to remember the RCEP is a lower level agreement than the CPTPP. It's meant to be more inclusive. It's meant to try and bring people on board. And so I hope that where Singapore brought it to at the end of 2018, the Thais this year can sort of get it over the line. We don't have that much time left, 7 months before, and the Thais don't have a government yet. We may have to slip into the next ASEAN cycle when Vietnam takes over. But I think it's important to get that moving because then you're making it a much more wider, inclusive agreement to have everyone together.
We were really grateful for the hard work that Singapore did last year to get the momentum that we did last year, and it's a pity we didn't get over the line. I think our feeling is that we've gone backwards a bit this year. We're still hopeful that we can get an RCEP agreement by the end of 2019, but it's going to take quite a lot of compromise, which maybe we'll see coming forward. We were talking about the old standard phrase, the cautious optimism, before, and let's hope everybody swallows a large dose of optimism to get there. I mean, we really see the importance of this as a geostrategic move as well as anything, at a time when we're seeing the erosion of confidence, as was mentioned earlier, in the multilateral system, and a return to unilateralism. Another piece of regional architecture like this is important to get to, but, well, we'll see.
What do you think, Wendy?
Well, I'd just say in our report, we do put forward some pragmatic suggestions for taking it over the finish line if the negotiations just, aren't coming together. One of those, there's really three ideas. One of them was just basically take what's on the table and then agree to renegotiate what hasn't been agreed on 3 to 5 years from now. That'd be number one. Number two would be to kind of get those countries or country that's not ready to step up to the plate to basically voluntarily step aside and join at a later stage. And third, the third idea was to have some kind of non-application clause in the agreement whereby countries, when they sign, they could say, we are not going to extend benefits to a certain country until something happens, kind of modeled after the non-application clause in the WTO. So these are just kind of three pragmatic suggestions on how to move forward. I will say, and I saw a press article last week, and I think this was, someone was attributing this to a Chinese idea, and I don't know if this is true or not, because this is very recent, where China may be advocating going to kind of an ASEAN +3 arrangement. In other words, my understanding is the three who wouldn't be involved then would be India, Australia, and New Zealand. And I don't know if this has any truth to it or something that's being discussed privately among certain RCEP members.
I think the idea of excluding some people, we should try to avoid it as much as possible. It is already such a sort of inclusive agreement. It really, the idea of RCEP came because ASEAN, and ASEAN is really that core of this architecture within the region, has FTAs with all the six. And so you have sort of a mixed sort of noodles of ASEAN China, ASEAN Japan, ASEAN Korea, Australia, New Zealand, India. And it became a way of evening this out to make it easier. In the end, the whole idea is to get businesses to make it easier for them to move trade and services around. And if despite having these ASEAN Plus agreements, we're not able to get an agreement, then I think we should try and keep everyone on board as far as possible, rather than people just say, okay, now I'm not ready for this, but you were ready for an ASEAN Plus one type of agreement. Why aren't you ready for this bigger agreement? The idea of regional integration is really the key in this. And the region, and Ambassador Hockey mentioned at the start about the 3 billion people in the region. If we can get those together, I think that would be really beneficial for the countries of the region, for the people of the region, for the business of the region, to allow, and if you're talking about people excluding themselves, you're going to invariably be the bigger ones. Then you lose that momentum of sort of trying to integrate that region. So let's try as far as possible to keep people in. I'm not familiar with some of the other sort of...
35 rounds? What do you think?
We have the stamina, so we just keep going with it.
Yeah, we would share that concern about the minus approach because, it's not going to really serve its purpose if it doesn't bring all the economies and all the major ones together. I don't know I'm not really knowledgeable enough to speak on the non-applicability approach that you've suggested, but maybe to get these diverse economies and diverse systems together, we all do need to perhaps make some further compromises without going too far down to dilute it. But if we spend too long on this, our concern is that the kind of political momentum that we had last year risks being frittered away.
Let's shift to another issue that's maybe also causing a little bit of anxiety, the WTO. What are the prospects for reform this year? And what are your country's priorities for WTO reform?
Okay. Well, first priority for us is the appellate body. And our ambassador, David Walker, in Geneva is leading the General Council informal process to try to find some solutions. Our second priority is really to get some disciplines on subsidisation of fisheries. And it won't surprise you that looking ahead to the ministerial next year, our third priority is disciplines on agricultural subsidies. So those are really our top three.
Well, our priority is to I'm less anxious about a WTO if we can make it work. We have an organization that countries came together to build because they saw the need 25 years ago. And I think that there's still a general will to keep it working. It may not be working in parts for some countries. The US has had some complaints about the WTO, but they haven't really walked away yet. So if we can just make it work better, New Zealand and Singapore both are small countries. And for us, having a global trading rule system is probably the most important part of it. That in a bilateral world, we will always be outmuscled by the big guys. And therefore, making sure that this framework can work is very, very critical for us. So we should redouble our efforts in making sure that countries see a value to it. Yes, there are bits and pieces that have to be tweaked and adjusted. There are, complaints about developing country status and things like that have to be sort of sorted out. But let's see what we can do. And I think that most of the rest of the WTO countries are committed to this, to make sure that this can work. It's then convincing some of the bigger guys that we really need your leadership on this. I would be disappointed if we cannot get it to work in some fashion or other, because it would really damage and hurt smaller countries that rely on this global trading framework.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it would be devastating for us if anything really seriously happened to the WTO, and indeed, as Ambassador Mirpuri says, for the developing countries of the world as well.
Did you want to add something?
No. Go ahead.
Yeah, I wanted to open it up to audience questions. I think we have microphones, because I know we have hopefully, a lot of interesting questions in the audience. Maybe we'll take 2 at a time, 2 or 3 at a time.
Hi, Walter Lohman with the Heritage Foundation. I wanted to make one point and then ask a question. I think we too often play down the significance of the RCEP. We always talking about it being a lower level agreement and not as quite as good as CPTPP, not as good as TPP. But if you really look at the benefits, and RSIS in Singapore has looked at it in some detail, actually the participating countries get as much value out of it as they do CPTPP. And in fact, for those countries that haven't yet joined CPTPP, it would actually give more value to them by virtue of the general higher tariffs in each and the size of China and India's involvement. So I'll comment on that as you will. The question I have is that we often talk about new entries into CPTPP in terms of meeting their high standards. As long as they can meet the high standards, they can come in. But we also talk about negotiations involving them. So if they have to meet the standards, what's the negotiation all about?
Are there other questions or not?
Well, the negotiation for higher standards.
Yeah.
We can go even higher, you know.
So an example is, a high standard in any chapter, right? You come in, you're an exceeding country, and you have certain laws on the books, and you want to know how does that fit into this rule. And so maybe you have a negotiation about how you kind of square that circle. So on the rules side, there's probably less ability to negotiate because the rules have been agreed on. But there's always questions with rules and always kind of aspects to the rules that need to be worked out when a country joins. And obviously, with respect to market access, those, the specific not only tariffs, but the services and investment commitments and government procurement commitments all need to be negotiated as part of the entry.
Thanks very much. Sherman Katz, a trade lawyer. Thanks, Wendy, and all the other speakers on the Institute for organizing this. On page 14 of the paper, you talk about launching negotiations to deal with subsidies. The purpose of this intervention is to stimulate comments from the panel about subsidies. You call for more prohibited subsidies. Two examples that come to mind are overcapacity subsidies. That is, subsidies that contribute to the glut we have in steel, for example. Another example is subsidies to non-credit-worthy companies, ghosts, if you will, that are keeping them active. Now, and I'd be curious of your comments about those two specifics. Procedurally, as you probably know, there is a trilateral group of ministers, the US, the EU, and Japan, who are meeting to talk about such disciplines. And indeed, they've recently spoken to a larger group, including New Zealand and Australia and Norway and Canada. And at least for me, this calls into question the US go-it-alone strategy. Dealing with China calls for an effort of many countries who are seriously affected by these subsidies and state-owned enterprises. So please share with us any thoughts you may have about these specific kinds of subsidies or this procedural approach.
Okay. Do we take one more question before we go to answering?
Hi, Craig Allen, U.S.-China Business Council. Can I ask, perhaps directing this at Wendy, I'd be curious your thoughts of the implications for U.S. exporters for RCEP. It would seem that TPP plus RCEP would be a very deleterious position for many U.S. exporters who will be forced to consider their markets in that $3 billion market area. Thank you.
Well, maybe I'll start. First, with respect, Craig, to your question, yes, I think RCEP, like CPTPP, once concluded, will have tariff cuts. And to the extent that those tariff cuts are not applied to the United States, that will further disadvantage U.S. exporters. But really the key question is what's going to be the level of tariff cutting commitments in RCEP? And frankly, that's one of the key obstacles to conclusion of this deal. You know, do they agree to 90% for all countries in terms of tariff reductions? And then what's that 10% that's not included? So I think it will have an effect, but we just won't be able to judge that effect until we have a better sense of how extensive the tariff cuts will be and on which specific products. So that'll be number one. With respect to the subsidies question, Sherman, thank you. You're obviously a much, you're an expert on subsidies. I'm not. But one thing I would say, we did put forward this recommendation about trying to, renegotiate, expand the WTO subsidies agreement, just kind of as another kind of lever to get at the issue of subsidies, which I think you identified. It's really not a bilateral issue. If you're going to deal with subsidies, you really need to do that with a group of countries. So whether you do it through expanding the trilateral work, trying to do it through the WTO, I mean, we could, in a bilateral deal, make some progress that could be built on through plurilateral, multilateral exercises. But this is, one issue that I think at the end of the day really needs to be tackled by a group of countries, and that the U.S. alone trying to negotiate a solution here I think is something that's not going to meet with success.
I don't know about subsidies, but I think your point about the U.S. still using the WTO is important. That the U.S. not just going alone, that the U.S. has enough sort of confidence, trust in the WTO to use that mechanism as well. I think that's a plus point. And then maybe they can see other values of the WTO as well in order not to break. I think that's important to engage them at that level.
We have another question over there.
Hi, Matt Goodman from CSAS. At the risk of making Ambassador Mirpuri uncomfortable, I'm going to ask a question he's heard me ask him before, which is I just looked up on what's left of my battery power on my phone, the world GDP rankings. Singapore is number 7. The United States is number 8. New Zealand's number 22. And yet Singapore still calls itself a developing country in the WTO. So you think the WTO should be tweaked. One of the things the U.S. is concerned about is that China and others are hiding behind the developing country status to gain benefits, special benefits. Would it help if Singapore were to self-declare itself what it really is, an advanced country? Do you think Wendy's idea, that's the first question. Second question, Wendy's idea, or in the report, the idea of getting rid of this distinction between developed and developing and just having it case by case and negotiating in future on the basis of what you really have to offer and what you need. Would that be reasonable or a sensible suggestion?
Singapore's developing country status is not just about the WTO. It's about the vulnerability of our economy to lots of outside influences. It's also about the fact that we are in a region with other developing countries. And there's a certain almost political association around this fact. So it's really, in the WTO, we don't take any of the benefits of a developing country. But as a nation, we still want to sort of associate ourselves with a group of countries that see themselves as developing, whether it's the G77, whether it's in the UN. So that becomes as important for us than really just that distinction that the WTO has made. We're prepared to have conversations to see what can be done within the WTO to look at this issue. But let us remain a developing country. That's really just us. We just feel that sort of sense that maybe we want to be closer to our neighbors, we want to be closer to a bigger group of countries rather than elevate ourselves to a position that we're not quite ready to take. If you look at Singapore's GDP, a lot of it is actually foreign investors coming in, foreign investments. We are still we have no energy. We buy our water as well from overseas. So there's plenty of sort of issues that leave us fairly vulnerable. So we're not quite ready to make that mental leap to say we're a developed country. But it's really not necessarily just only in the WTO. It's across the board.
You know, on the basis of vulnerability, we could maybe argue that New Zealand was a developing country.
Can I just
Can welcome you into our club, you know? We'll take everyone on board.
You know, it's interesting when we met as a group, and just to remind people that Indonesia and China were part of our group, we had the same discussion about, you know, how we can get around this. I mean, I reminded the group, Korea reminded the group that for Korea, you know, their approach is they're developing for agriculture, but they're developed for other sectors. So we discussed, you know, would that be a useful recommendation? But as a group, we did come to the conclusion, and we talked a bit about the TPP, because remember in the TPP, there's no developing country status. Basically, you negotiate the commitments you need, and for a country like Vietnam, you know, they did that, and they were given more leeway. They were given longer transition times. People recognized they had a lot more to do to get where the other countries were. And so we were able, after discussing this, to kind of come up with an agreement that we all felt comfortable with, was that for ongoing and for future negotiations, forget the distinction except for the category of the least developing countries, and that would allow countries like, we didn't say Singapore, but other countries, and they could just continue to say they're developing because of other organizations and their overall status. So, you know, I think that's, you know, I don't think that's the end of the story, this kind of proposal, but I think it's something that's really worth pursuing. And I wonder, you know, if some country really put that forward and trying to bring other countries on board, I think it's a very pragmatic way of moving forward on an issue that's really kind of critical for the WTO. I mean, my understanding is 2/3 of WTO members declare themselves as developing. That's kind of crazy.
You know, just as a personal comment, having worked for many years in multilateralism, I think it's quite a neat solution, because it would be much easier to move away from the existing tags than to try to push people from one camp to the other.
Let's take both of these, and then I'll let you guys go to wine.
Hi, I'm Adam Schwarza with Asia Group Advisors. I have a question really about the politics of trade and how countries think about joining trade groups, which happy for anybody to comment, but I suppose I'd direct it to Wendy, as the American on the group, although it's really a kind of a Trump administration question. In some recent travels in Southeast Asia, I've heard the question asked in Thailand and Indonesia and the Philippines about whether, given the Trump administration and to some extent President Trump's personal antipathy towards the TPP, the question is asked whether the desire to join the CPTPP would, you know, how that would affect their relations with the U.S., whether there would be some punitive response to that. I hear less of that in Thailand, but I hear more of that in Indonesia and Philippines. And I'm wondering, you know, and I guess your guess is as good as anybody's, but you know, whether there's any merit to that concern, and maybe Ambassador Mirpuri have a thought on that as well. Thank you.
There's only one way to find out.
One more question there.
Yes, I'm Ed Gerwin from the Progressive Policy Institute. I'll keep this short. I don't want to keep people from Australian wine. My question is about the use of national security. The Trump administration is using national security as kind of an all-purpose get-out-of-jail card to evade WTO rules and norms. I'd be interested in your perspective on the implications of that approach globally, and what other countries are doing to react to that and to try to bolster the rules-based system in the face of that kind of threat.
You going to go first to Adam's question?
I'll leave it to you.
You know, politics is not just, around trade is not just in the U.S. Singapore, which is highly globalized, this year we have 200 years of the British coming to Singapore. And it is a cause for some commemoration. A lot of people say, why do you celebrate colonialism? Because that put Singapore on the trading map in many ways. That made us choose English as the first language. But even in a place like Singapore, trade is always sensitive. So what we've tried to do, and I'm not offering this as a prescription necessarily for the Americans or any other country, is that we always have to keep upgrading the workforce. It's one thing to say we're going to do trade agreements. We have a constant process of reskilling the workforce, looking at skills future, because you just have to keep telling people that job that you had yesterday may not be there tomorrow. There is competition coming from around the world. And Singapore's cost structures are as expensive as the US. We don't have labor, we don't have land. Every cost structure is expensive. But then to try and keep, so it's a lot of domestic work around it. So trade is one thing where we talk about globally and multilaterally. A lot of that adjustment has to take place at home. And that's where we engage with unions, we engage with workers, the government comes in there to play that role, to make sure that there's a constant process of people saying, let's plan for that job of the future. And it's not just younger people entering the workforce, it is the older people already in the workforce that you have to, because they're the ones you have to keep reminding them that, there is still a future for you despite these changes. And these are very disruptive. They're very disruptive for the U.S., and that's why I can understand the politics of trade over here. As I watched the elections here in 2015 and 2016, and these haven't gone away, but they're disruptive across the board. And you see that in election after election in Europe, in Asia Pacific, that this issue of why must we connect to the world? And then we think that one approach that we feel is really keep working with the people to keep reminding them that there is no other choice. There will be benefits, but we really work with you to upgrade you along the way.
Can I just add a similar thing in New Zealand? We've got a tripartite forum, which is government, business and trade unions, to talk specifically about the sort of disruptions from, everything, digital trade, technology, the future of work, and also to kind of keep that permission space for free trade agreements, for free trade generally. The government launched last year what they call a Trade for All agenda, which involved a big consultation process all around the country with various community and business groups, with iwi, that is Maori, to talk about the benefits of trade, and also the current budget that's just been produced is really trying to spread those benefits more broadly through the community. But we don't take it for granted that we've got a country full of natural supporters of free trade agreements.
Did you want to end on anything? Okay, thank you so much, Wendy, for putting this together. Thank you, panelists. I'm excited to have a 3-woman panel, no offense. Thank you for hosting this. Please join me in thanking our panel, and let's enjoy some Australian wine.